Hi, my name is Desmond. I'm an amateur photographer and I've worked out how TTL BL meters. There are many varying opinions on how it works, and there are many websites that actually are telling the wrong story about TTL BL. If you read a website that tells you that the subject has to be central and there has to be background lighting for TTL BL to work, it is outdated. Because that's the way it would work on a Nikon D100, but Nikon have changed the information they send to the flash. So now instead of it using the matrix metering pattern, it uses the focus points. The reason you should be interested in how TTL BL meters is because your built-in speedlight works in TTL BL mode. The Nikon SP400 works only in TTL BL mode. And when you start using wireless Nikon flash, it meters in TTL BL mode, even though you have the flash head set at TTL. So let's have a look at some tests to see how TTL BL meters. First thing I want to demonstrate is how the pre-flash system works. Whether you're in TTL or TTL BL, the camera does a pre-flash to measure the flash output it's going to need for the main exposure. I have the camera in second curtain mode at the moment, at 1 second exposure, so you see the pre-flash, and you see the main flash afterwards. And there's our exposure, which was perfect. It's in TTL BL mode now. Now, if I block that pre-flash, and the camera doesn't see it, it fires much stronger, which proves that in TTL BL mode, the camera uses a pre-flash reading to calculate its exposure. But there's something else as well. It uses the focus distance from the lens. So if I take a normal picture, the exposure is right, and I change the focus. Change it to infinity, it fired much stronger because I thought the subject was further away. Now I bring it back to close focus and I tell the flash effectively that the subject is closer than it thought. And the flash fire is weaker because it thought the subject was much closer. So TTL BL uses focus distance from the lens and it uses the pre-flash reading. Now I'm going to add a complication. We know that TTL BL uses the focus distance from the lens when the flash is pointing forward. But now I'm going to point the flash up at the ceiling. Now the flash has to travel further than the distance that the lens is telling it. So we take a picture, and the exposure is still correct. Now we change the focus distance manually to infinity, and there's no change in those exposures. We change it to close focus, there's still no change in the exposure, which shows that now the flash is ignoring the focus distance from the lens. So what is the difference between TTL flash and TTL BL flash if they're both only using the pre-flash mode when you're using bounce flash? Well, to illustrate this, we've got the camera set up now in TTL mode again. Normal flash 1/200th of a second, f5.6, ISO 200. Using bounce flash, and I've moved the subject to the side. Now you can see TTL flash exposes quite a bit brighter because the subject is on the side and it's using the center of the frame. Go to TTL BL. And there's TTL flash is TTL-BL. It's exposed properly even though the subject is on the side. Eventually I worked out that the secret to the way TTL-BL meters is that it's using the focus points. TTL flash uses either the matrix metering pattern or the center weighted pattern, while TTL-BL uses the focus points. As I mentioned at the beginning, TTL-BL and wireless Nikon flash both meter the same. So as soon as you take the flashes off the camera and use wireless mode, you're actually metering in TTL-BL mode. And a lot of people complain that Nikon wireless flash underexposes in some situations, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, we take the same picture again with the subject off center, and we see that the exposure is okay. Now I'm going to add something white to the center of the frame, and as long as there's something white under any of the focus points, TTL-BL underexposes. You can see the difference in exposure. There's our picture there. There's the previous one which is a little bit brighter. We add white to the frame, it underexposes. And the secret to this is that TTL-BL meters for the brightest focus point in the frame, which is why outdoors in bright sunlight it's good for balancing the light, and if there's something bright in the frame, it adds the two exposures together and backs off the flash to prevent blown highlights. So what I generally do is either on the exposure compensation button or on the flash head, dial in plus 1.3 when there's something white in the frame. And now I've got my original exposure back again and the whites look right and they're in the perfect place on the histogram compared to the previous one when the 1.3 stops dimmer. So when there's something white in the frame, add 1.3 exposure compensation or flash head compensation, and that generally fixes the problem. So now we know how TTL-BL meters differently to TTL mode. TTL just uses the plain matrix metering frame or a center weighted metering frame that you've selected, and the subject has to be central. As soon as we move the subject, TTL overexposes, and if the subject size changes, TTL output varies as well. TTL-BL, on the other hand, uses all the focus points. I'm using a Nikon D90, and with its 11 focus points, as long as there is one focus point on a white object, I know I have to add exposure compensation when I'm using bounce flash. With direct flash it's different because it's using the focus distance from the lens, but of course we always try to avoid direct flash. When we start using wireless flash in different groups all on one channel, we could take 2 or 3 flashes, move them all to one side and have them on channel 3, A, B and C, then TTL-BL can do the maths. It adds up the exposure from the pre-flashes and it adjusts the flashes accordingly so that you don't have any blown highlights. That's the difference between TTL-BL and TTL. TTL doesn't know what the ambient is, so it just fires what it thinks it would need if it was the only light source to expose the subject properly, and quite often that means overexposure and you have to dial in negative compensation depending on the conditions. So when you're using wireless flash, remember that it is metering in TTL-BL mode and that it can add the exposures from different flash groups, and it can calculate it so that they don't overexpose or blow any highlights. And as we've seen, if there's white in the frame or something brighter than average grey, you need to add exposure compensation. And as long as one focus point is on that white object and it's a big enough object, your exposure will be consistent because it will be metering for the brightest focus point. If your background is black, then it will meter for the subject.